Jay, before we went to break, you suggested one way to tackle the out-of-control debt problem is to rein in, I guess, salaries for employees. So you mentioned and referenced something called the Sunshine List. I know what that is. Some of our viewers may not. Can you explain what the Sunshine List is?
So that's a list, thanks to Mike Harris, that is put out every year that shows Ontario taxpayers exactly who is making more than $100,000 that works for the government. And this list has grown exponentially. We actually have the average teacher in the province of Ontario. And let me say, teachers are very important. I have some in my family, but the average teacher in Ontario is making nearly $100,000. And so as we continue to confront this massive deficit, we really have to think about how we're going to deal with that. The Ford government has introduced legislation that puts a 1% growth cap on government salaries, but frankly, it's not enough where we are today. And we need to start talking at the very least about freezes and potentially more going forward.
Sure, but some might suggest, and David, I'll let you jump in here, that, well, if somebody's worked for 30 plus years with the government, that naturally their salary will just keep increasing, and eventually, yes, they'll hit up to that 100,000 mark. You know, I'm still shocked that there are that many government employees making that much money, but, you know, and some will say, oh, well, you have to be competitive to get the right talent. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree that you have to be competitive to get the right talent, but at the end of the day, the salary is not supposed to be indicative of how many years you've served. It's supposed to be indicative of the value that you provide for taxpayers. And so if you've spent, I will make up a government job of digging holes alongside the road, or pick something that is not necessarily as advanced. Your time served does not necessarily mean that you've created more value for taxpayers over time. So I think that's something that's that is often missed in the conversation about government salary. But I think there's a way out of this, which is attrition, so allowing for people to retire, leaning on digitization, especially in the healthcare sector. So using, which may sound scary to some listeners, but AI functionality for even just the most basic intake functions in our healthcare system, which research shows that consumers and patients are becoming actually more comfortable doing, eliminates the need to hire new people to fill those roles where folks have retired. And so that's a way you do so without mass firing everyone, or wide-scale layoffs, which would be politically disadvantageous. But it's a way of creating a more dynamic, in this instance, healthcare system, saving taxpayers money, and ultimately giving patients in the province a more dynamic healthcare system, which improves outcomes.
Now, I think it's an important, I'll let you jump in there in a moment, Jay, but I think that's important that you kind of delineated that this is through attrition. So through folks retiring. So you're not firing anyone, you're not laying people off, but through attrition, you just don't refill those positions because you may have found more efficiencies or a way to do it better since maybe the 40 years since that person started at that job. Jay, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, the Harper government was actually quite successful in trying to decrease the amount of government workers at the federal level through that very attrition process. But I should also say that there are studies that show that there's a 10% wage gap between the public sector and the private sector, that a comparable job in the public sector working for government gets 10% more in salary than those in the private sector do. So it's not just a question of, paying people, for their whatever position they're in. This is actually proof that you're paying people more for a comparable position in the private sector, which is not something we can have or afford or sustain as a people in Ontario.
Now, Jay, is that, we only have 30 seconds left, is that common in many jurisdictions in the world, or is this an Ontario, Canada specific problem?
It's somewhat common, but Ontario is one of the highest gap provinces in the country when it comes to that. We have some of the highest paid government employees in the country. Our Sunshine List is by far the biggest in the country, and so action definitely has to be taken.